It is dawn. The long ships are already in the water. Inside the longhouse, a fire is burning low. And before a single weapon is picked up, before a single shield is strapped on, the warriors are eating. This is not a ritual. This is not a final meal before death. This is fuel. And what they put into their bodies that morning would determine whether they had the strength to survive what came next. So what did Vikings actually eat before a battle? The answer is not the wild boar feast and endless mead that popular imagination has built around Norse warriors. The reality, pieced together from archaeological evidence, isotope analysis of Viking skeletal remains, and historical sources, is more specific, more practical, and far more interesting than the myth. For 99% of human history, going into physical combat meant relying entirely on what your body had stored and what you had eaten in the hours before. There was no pre-workout supplement, no energy gel. The pre-battle meal was the only fuel system a Viking warrior had. And the Norse understood this better than almost any culture of their time. Archaeologist Neil Price of Uppsala University, one of the foremost scholars of Viking Age Scandinavia, has noted that Norse warfare was rarely the spontaneous chaos depicted in films. Raids and battles were planned, crews assembled days or weeks in advance. And food preparation before a campaign was a serious, deliberate undertaking, because a hungry warrior was a dead warrior. Let's reconstruct what that morning actually looked like. The first thing on the table, almost without exception, was protein, specifically dried and salted fish. Stockfish, cod that had been split, gutted, and air-dried on wooden racks until it became hard as wood, was one of the most important foods in the Norse world. It required no refrigeration. It traveled easily, and pound for pound, it was extraordinarily calorie and protein dense. A warrior could eat stockfish cold, straight from a pack, or soften it by boiling, and either way, it delivered exactly what a body preparing for sustained physical exertion needed. Modern nutritional analysis of dried cod shows it contains roughly 80 grams of protein per 100 grams, nearly double what fresh fish provides, because the drying process concentrates everything except water. This is not a coincidence of preservation. It is, functionally, one of the most efficient pre-exertion protein sources available anywhere in the medieval world. Alongside the fish came meat, usually whatever had been slaughtered or smoked in the preceding days. Pork was common in coastal and inland Scandinavian settlements alike, and pigs were often slaughtered specifically before a planned raid or campaign, providing fresh fat and protein to a crew about to expend enormous physical energy. Mutton and goat were also regularly consumed, particularly in regions where sheep farming dominated, like parts of Norway and Iceland. And then there was the fat. This is the part modern diet culture tends to misunderstand. Vikings did not fear fat. They needed it. Butter, animal fat rendered from slaughtered livestock, and fatty cuts of meat were prized, not avoided. Bioarchaeological isotope studies, which examine the chemical signatures left in bone and tooth enamel to reconstruct ancient diets, consistently show that Norse populations consumed significant quantities of animal fat alongside protein. For a body about to row for hours and then fight in heavy gear, fat represented dense, slow-burning energy that complemented the faster fuel that carbohydrates provided. Speaking of carbohydrates, grain was present, but it played a supporting role, not the starring one. Barley was the dominant grain across most of Scandinavia, more reliable than wheat in the short, harsh growing seasons of the north. It was eaten as flatbread, cooked into a thick porridge, or brewed into the most important Norse beverage of all, ale. Norse ale, brewed from barley and sometimes flavored with herbs like bog myrtle, was a daily staple, not an occasional indulgence. It was safer to drink than untreated water in many settlements, and it provided real caloric value, carbohydrates and a modest amount of alcohol that, in the quantities typically consumed with a meal, would not have impaired physical performance the way modern assumptions about pre-battle drinking often suggest. Historian Kim Hjardar has emphasized that the romanticized image of Vikings drinking themselves into a battle frenzy with mead is largely a later invention. Mead, fermented honey, was actually a luxury beverage, reserved for feasts, celebrations, and high-status occasions, not the standard daily drink of a warband preparing for combat. The everyday Viking beverage was ale, consumed in moderate quantities precisely because a warrior whose coordination and judgment were compromised was a liability, not an asset, to the men rowing beside him. Dairy filled out the meal. Skyr, a thick, protein-rich, yogurt-like dairy product still eaten in Iceland today, was a staple across the Norse world. So was cheese, which could be made in large batches and stored for extended periods, making it ideal provisioning for a campaign that might last weeks. Both delivered concentrated protein and fat in a stable, transportable form. Honey, when available, served as a quick source of simple sugar, a fast-acting energy source that would have been valuable in the hours immediately before physical exertion, much the way an athlete today might consume something sugar-dense before a competition. What is notably absent from this picture is the heavy bread and grain-dominated diet that defined most of medieval Europe at the time. While English and French peasants were subsisting largely on bread, pottage, and limited animal protein, Norse populations, particularly those preparing for raids and campaigns, had disproportionate access to fish, meat, and dairy. This was partly geography. Scandinavia's coastline, fjords, and pastureland supported fishing and livestock far better than they supported large-scale grain agriculture. But it was also strategy. A warband preparing for a raid needed warriors capable of rowing for days, then fighting in heavy chainmail and wielding weapons that demanded explosive strength, then potentially rowing again to retreat with plunder. That kind of sustained, repeated physical output required a fundamentally different fuel strategy than subsistence farming. High protein, high fat, moderate carbohydrate, minimal reliance on bread alone. It looks, by pure coincidence of necessity rather than nutritional science, remarkably similar to what modern sports nutritionists recommend for endurance athletes undertaking extreme physical exertion. There is also evidence that warriors ate with deliberate restraint immediately before combat itself, even if the days leading up to it involved substantial eating. A stomach overloaded with food in the final hour before intense physical exertion diverts blood flow to digestion rather than muscle, and Norse warriors, whose lives depended on immediate physical performance, would have understood this intuitively, even without modern physiological language to explain it. Sagas describe warriors eating well in the days before a battle, but the final meal before combat itself tended to be lighter and more focused. Bread, dried fish, perhaps a small amount of ale. So picture it now. The fire in the longhouse is still smoking. Outside, the longship waits, its hull already loaded with shields and weapons. Inside, a warrior tears a strip of stockfish with his hands, chews it slowly, washes it down with ale brewed weeks earlier. Beside him, someone else cuts into a wedge of hard cheese. A bowl of skyr is passed along the table. There is no feast. There is no excess. There is only what the body needs to do what is about to be asked of it. This was not a celebration. It was preparation. And by the time the oars hit the water, every man in that longship had already made the first decision that would determine whether he survived the day. Not with a weapon, but with what he chose to eat.